Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
In the annals of psychological science, few documents carry the paradoxical weight of Alfred Binet and Théodore Simon's 1905 publication, Méthodes nouvelles pour le diagnostic du niveau intellectuel des anomorphes, born of a specific, pragmatic, and fundamentally humane request from the French Ministry of Public Instruction. This modest scale of 30 tasks would become the conceptual seed of a global enterprise in mental measurement. Its legacy is a profound study in unintended consequences, a testament to how a carefully circumscribed diagnostic tool, designed for educational remediation, could be transformed into an instrument of profound social stratification. To understand this work is to explore the fertile intellectual soil of fin de siècle Paris, to dissect the elegant simplicity of its design, and to trace the subsequent, often troubling, metamorphosis of its core ideas as they traversed cultural and ideological landscapes. The 1905 scale stands as a monumental achievement in individual psychology, yet its history serves as a permanent, cautionary tale regarding the chasm that can separate scientific intention from societal application. The genesis of the Binet-Simon scale is inseparable from the social and political currents of the French Third Republic. The Jules Ferry laws of the 1880s had established free, mandatory, and secular primary education, a cornerstone of Republican ideology. This noble project, however, created an immediate and practical challenge for educators. Classrooms were now filled with children of widely varying abilities, and a method was needed to identify those who, through some intellectual deficit, were unable to profit from standard instruction. The French government, seeking a scientific and objective basis for placing these children into special classes, or classes to perfectionment, established a commission for this purpose. Alfred Binet, already a prominent figure in French experimental psychology, was a leading member. Before Binet, the dominant approach to measuring intellect, championed by figures like Sir Francis Galton in England and James McKeen Cattell in the United States, was rooted in psychophysics. This tradition assumed that higher mental functions were contingent upon the efficiency of basic sensory and motor processes. Consequently, their tests measured reaction times, sensory acuity, and grip strength, operating under the belief that a keen sensorium was the foundation of a keen. Binet, through his own painstaking research, had grown deeply skeptical of this atomistic approach. His earlier collaborations, particularly with his student Victor Henry, involved exhaustive attempts to correlate performance on these psychophysical tasks with academic success. The results were consistently disappointing. The correlations were vanishingly small. This empirical failure convinced Binet that intelligence was a far more complex and holistic faculty. He argued that it manifested in higher-order processes like judgment, comprehension, reasoning, and invention. His own informal, yet insightful, studies of his two daughters, Madeleine and Alice, further reinforced this view. He observed how they solved problems, demonstrating that the quality of their thinking was far more illuminating than the speed of their reflexes. He was also influenced by the work of the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus, who had used a sentence-completion task to assess the mental fatigue of schoolchildren. This task, requiring comprehension and logical inference, was a direct precursor to the types of items Binet would come to favour. Thus, when the government commission sought a solution, Binet was intellectually primed to reject the prevailing Galtonian orthodoxy and propose something startlingly different. He sought a measure of what he termed intelligence naturelle, the global capacity for practical judgment and adaptation, a faculty that could only be assessed through its complex manifestations. The 1905 Binet-Simon scale was the fruit of this perspective. It was a masterpiece of pragmatic design, a series of 30 tasks arranged in a rough order of increasing difficulty. The scale was a world away from the brass instruments and stopwatches of the psychophysical laboratory. Its materials were simple everyday objects, pictures, and a series of carefully phrased questions. The tasks began with the most basic functions, such as the ability of an infant to follow a lit match with its eyes. They progressed through items like repeating spoken digits, naming designated objects in a picture, and comparing two lines of different lengths. The more advanced items probed directly at the higher faculties. Binet prized defining abstract words like charity or justice, repeating a complex sentence of 15 words verbatim, and identifying the absurdities in illogical statements. The entire examination was designed to be administered individually in less than half an hour, a practical consideration for its intended use in busy schools. The true innovation of the 1905 scale lay in its conceptual framework. It abandoned the search for a single, absolute score of intelligence. Instead, it produced a diagnostic classification. A child's performance yielded a mental level. If a child passed the tests typically mastered by a 3-year-old, they were classified as an idiot. If they succeeded at the level of a 7-year-old, their classification was imbecile. Those performing below their chronological peers but above the imbecile level were termed morons, a term Binet borrowed from the Greek for foolish to designate the highest grade of deficiency. While these labels appear jarring to the modern ear, within Binet's framework they were purely descriptive categories meant to guide educational placement. They were an assessment of current functioning, a snapshot in time. The entire enterprise was predicated on the idea that the scale would identify those pupils who required specialized instruction to improve their intellectual capacities. In its methodology, was empirical and iterative. The placement of each item in a hierarchy was determined by testing it on a sample of approximately 50 normal children and a smaller number of children identified as having learning disabilities. This normative comparison, crude by modern standards, revolutionary step, establishing that a child's intelligence could be meaningfully assessed relative to their. Crucially, Binet himself harbored deep reservations about the potential for his work to be misinterpreted. He repeatedly insisted that his scale was a practical device for a singular purpose: the identification of children in need of pedagogical support. He saw intelligence as a multifaceted, malleable, and learnable set of skills. In a powerful counter-narrative to the deterministic views that would soon co-opt his work, Binet developed what he called l'orthopédie mentale, or mental orthopedics. This was a program of cognitive exercises designed to enhance attention, memory, and judgment, the very faculties his scale measured. For Binet, a low score was a starting point for intervention, a diagnosis that demanded a therapeutic response. He wrote with potent clarity that intelligence was a capacity that could be augmented through effort and proper training. With a prescience that is almost poignant in retrospect, he warned against the brutal pessimism of viewing an individual's intelligence as a fixed, inborn quantity, a single number, that would seal their fate. He saw his scale as a tool for cultivation, an instrument for the gardener, a way to determine which plants needed special care to flourish. This carefully circumscribed, humane vision for the scale would undergo a profound and rapid transformation upon its journey across the Atlantic. The first major American proponent was Henry H. Goddard, director of the research laboratory at the Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Girls and Boys in New Jersey. Goddard translated the Binet-Simon scale and applied it with great zeal to the residents of his institution. While he was instrumental in popularizing the test, he also initiated a subtle but decisive ideological shift. Goddard, deeply influenced by Mendelian genetics and the burgeoning eugenics movement, began to interpret the scale's results as measures of a fixed, innate, and hereditary entity. The condition of the children at Vineland, in his view, was an immutable fact of their biology. The diagnostic labels that Binet intended as guides for education became, for Goddard, markers of inherent and unchangeable biological limits. This reification of intelligence was a critical departure from Binet's own thinking. The transformation was completed and canonized by Louis Terman, a psychologist at Stanford University. In 1916, Terman published his landmark revision, the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scales. This was a far more psychometrically sophisticated instrument. Terman administered the test to a much larger and more systematically selected sample of American children, refining the items and extending the scale to assess superior intelligence in adults. His most fateful innovation, however, was the adoption and popularization of an idea from the German psychologist William Stern, the intelligence quotient, or IQ. This was calculated by the formula of mental age divided by chronological age, with the result multiplied by 100. The creation of the IQ score finalized the conversion of Binet's qualitative, descriptive tool into a single, quantitative, and seemingly scientific number. For Terman, as for Goddard, this number represented an inborn, largely hereditary, and stable trait. In the introduction to his manual, Terman laid bare this deterministic philosophy, arguing that the mentally deficient required supervision and control, and that their procreation should be curtailed to prevent societal decline. The gardener's tool had been reforged into a social yardstick. The consequences of this Americanization of Binet's work were immense and far-reaching. During the First World War, Terman and other psychologists, including Robert Yerkes, developed the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests, the first mass-administered group intelligence tests, given to over 1.5 million recruits. These tests, heavily based on the Stanford Binet model, were used to sort soldiers into roles and officer training programs. After the war, the momentum of the testing movement spilled into civilian life. IQ tests became fixtures in American schools, used to track students into academic or vocational streams, often entrenching existing social and racial inequalities. The results of the Army tests, which showed lower average scores for immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, were wielded as scientific justification for the Restrictive Immigration Act of 1904. Binet's simple scale conceived in a Parisian classroom to help children learn, had become a powerful weapon in the arsenal of the American eugenics movement, used to rationalize racial hierarchies and limit human potential. It is a supreme and tragic irony that a device created to facilitate education became a primary instrument for denying it to so many. Over time, the reified concept of IQ faced formidable and sustained critique. Scholars like Stephen Jay Gould, in his seminal work The Mismeasure of Man, meticulously deconstructed the statistical fallacies, cultural biases, and deterministic assumptions that underpinned the work of Goddard, Terman, and their contemporaries. The very idea of a single number capturing the totality of human intellect came under fire from multiple theoretical perspectives, including Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences and Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory. Later generations of psychometricians, perhaps most notably David Wechsler, developed new scales like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale WISE and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children WISC. These tests, while still producing an overall IQ score, sought to provide a more nuanced picture by incorporating both verbal and non-verbal performance subtests, yielding a profile of cognitive strengths and weaknesses. In a sense, this move toward a more multifaceted assessment represented a quiet return to the spirit of Binet, who always saw intelligence as a composite of distinct, though related, abilities. In conclusion, the 1905 Binet-Simon scale remains a watershed moment in the history of science and society. As a piece of psychological engineering, it was brilliant, an elegant solution that sidestepped the theoretical dead ends of its time to address a pressing human problem. Binet and Simon bequeathed to psychology its first practical method for assessing higher cognitive functions, launching the entire field of psychometrics and profoundly shaping the practices of clinical psychology and special education. Yet, this brilliant invention carried within it a vulnerability. Its apparent simplicity and numerical output was seductive, inviting an interpretation of intelligence as a simple, fixed, and rankable commodity. Binet's own cautious, humanistic, and interventionist philosophy was largely swept aside by a more deterministic and socially convenient ideology. The legacy of the 1905 scale is therefore irreducibly dual. It is the story of a powerful scientific innovation and the story of its appropriation and distortion. It reminds us that the meaning of a scientific tool is defined by the hands that wield it and the purposes they serve. The echo of Binet's work is still heard in every classroom where a child is assessed, and his cautionary words about the limits of measurement and the boundless potential for growth remain as urgent and necessary today as they were over a century ago.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.